The single glass of pale gold liquid sat on the judge's table, catching the October sun like a preserved piece of afternoon. It was the only thing of that color in the entire Providence Creek Town Fair. All around it were the ambers and browns of cider, the pride of the valley, but this year the ciders were thin and sharp, the color of disappointment. Silence pressed in on the crowd, a thick, woolen quiet that muffled the sound of the wind in the canvas tents. Silas Croft, whose cider had won the blue ribbon for 9 years running, stood with his arms crossed, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked at Elspeth, standing alone by the table, and the smirk deepened. He saw a woman who had bought a barrel of Bruised Pears for $4, and he knew, as the whole town knew, what came from foolishness. The head judge, a stir man named Miller who owned the town's mill and respected only gravity and grindstones, lifted the glass. He sniffed it. His eyebrows, thick and gray as hornets' nests, drew together. He took a small, careful sip. The crowd held its breath. Miller's eyes, which had been narrowed in skepticism, widened. He did not speak. He took another, larger swallow, rolling the liquid over his tongue. He set the glass down with a definitive click that echoed in the unnatural quiet. He looked not at the other judges, but straight at Elspeth, and then he looked at the stunned face of Silas Croft. But that was October. The story of a glass and the silence began in the mud of a late March thaw, with a decision that the whole town agreed was proof that Elspeth was not only alone, but likely touched in the head. She had inherited her uncle's scrap of land a year prior, a place the town considered little more than a stone quarry with delusions of being a farm. It was 20 acres of stubborn clay and scrub oak, with a sway-backed barn and a house that seemed to sigh every time the wind blew. The town's verdict on her, a woman alone in her late 20s with no family to speak of, was a mixture of pity and quiet scorn. She was a curiosity, a problem waiting to happen. The day it began, she was in town for salt and flour when she saw the wagon. It belonged to a farmer from the richer lands upriver, and it was piled high with pears. They were a sorry sight, mottled with brown and purple bruises, some split open and weeping sugary juice that drew a cloud of hopeful bees. The farmer, a man with a face like a sour apple, was arguing with the grocer. "They're worthless," the grocer said, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "I can't sell these. They'll be rotten by nightfall," the farmer swore. "A whole barrel. What am I supposed to do? Haul them to the river and dump them?" That was when Elspeth stepped forward. The crowd parted, watching her. She walked to the wagon and picked up a pear. It was heavy in her hand, the skin thin and bruised, but the flesh beneath felt firm. She could smell the warm, honeyed scent of it, a smell that promised something other than rot. "How much for the barrel?" she asked, her voice quiet. The farmer stared at her. The grocer laughed. "Lady, he's telling you. They're pig feed. I have pigs," Elspeth said, her gaze steady on the farmer. "How much?" Desperate to be rid of his load and the shame of it, the farmer spat. $4. "And you haul it." It was a ridiculous sum for something so close to garbage, but it was also a challenge. $4 was a week of careful eating. The town was watching, waiting to see the fool prove herself. Silas Croft himself was there, leaning against a post, his fine coat unbuttoned. He caught her eye and gave a small, pitying shake of his head. Elspeth reached into the pocket of her worn dress and pulled out the coins. She counted them into the farmer's hand. The deal was done. The laughter wasn't loud, but it was there, a rustle of murmurs and shared glances. As she arranged to have the barrel brought out to her place, she heard someone mutter, "A fool and her money are soon parted." She didn't turn. She just stood there for a moment, the smell of the bruised fruit filling her senses, and felt not foolishness, but the first stirrings of a secret, stubborn hope. She was hauling off more than pears. She was hauling off their certainty, their scorn, and a possibility they were too blind to see. The barrel arrived late that afternoon, a monument to her supposed folly sitting in the middle of her yard. It smelled of sun and sugar and the first hint of fermentation. Her nearest neighbor, Mrs. Zelenko, saw it from her porch. She was an old woman, bent and wrinkled as a dried apricot, who had come from a country where the winters were long and the word waste was a sin. She shuffled over, her eyes bright and curious in their web of wrinkles. The town saw a barrel of garbage. Mrs. Zelenko saw a barrel of ingredients. She peered into it, her nose twitching. She poked a finger into a split pear and tasted the juice. She looked at Elspeth, not with pity, but with a shrewd and knowing respect. "Ah," she said, her voice accented, the words round and heavy. "In my country, we say the sweetest juice comes from the ugliest fruit. What do you make?" Elspeth, who had been bracing for another wave of neighborly concern that felt exactly like judgment, felt a knot of tension in her shoulders release. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Perry, maybe. My grandmother used to talk of it." Mrs. Zelenko nodded slowly, a deep, ancient affirmation. "Is good, stronger than cider." And from these, she gestured at the bruised bounty. "The yeast is already awake. You must work fast." She gave Elspeth a long, searching look. "They laugh at you in town." It wasn't a question. "They do," Elspeth said. Mrs. Zelenko patted her arm, her hand surprisingly strong. "Let them. A thing is not worthless because a blind man cannot see its value. You have good hands. Use them." That was all the blessing Elspeth needed. For the next 3 days, she worked with a fierce, focused energy. The work was her shield against the town's opinion. First, she hauled the heavy barrel into the shade of the barn. Then began the sorting, a task that occupied her from before dawn until the light failed. She laid out old canvases on the barn floor. Each pair was handled, judged. The ones that had truly turned, soft and vinegary, went into a bucket for her 2 pigs, who grunted their profound approval. The ones that were merely bruised, split, or misshapen went into a second, much larger pile. These were the heart of the project. Her hands were sticky with juice, stained brown. The air in the barn grew thick and sweet, buzzing with insects. She worked through the arithmetic of it in her head, the quiet counting that was the language of her survival. So many pears, so many hours of work. 1 barrel bought for $4. How much juice would it yield? How many bottles? What was a bottle of something no one here had ever tasted even worth? The numbers were ghosts, but the work was real. She had an old screw press in the back of the barn, another relic from her uncle. It was rusted and stiff. She spent half a day cleaning it, oiling the great iron screw with pig fat until it turned with a reluctant groan. She found old casks, their hoops loose, and spent an evening hammering them tight, soaking them to swell the wood and seal the cracks. The town thought she was feeding slop to her pigs. They saw her hauling buckets and assumed she was cleaning up her foolish mistake. No one came to visit. No one offered to help. She was left alone with her work, and for that, she was grateful. The secrecy was a comfort, a wall she built around her fragile experiment. She crushed the pears, bag after bag of pulp, the scent of them sharp and clean. The juice that ran out was not clear, but a cloudy, pale green gold. It was the color of possibility. She filled the casks, leaving room for the froth of fermentation, and rolled them down the sloping stone ramp into her root cellar. There, in the cool, earthy dark, she left them. The work was done. Now, she had to wait and trust in the slow, invisible alchemy of yeast and sugar and time. The cellar door closed with a heavy thud, sealing her secret in the dark, like a coal banked low under ash, waiting for the right moment to be coaxed back into flame. Weeks turned into a month. Spring deepened. The scrub oaks leafed out, and the hard clay of Elspeth's land softened enough for a garden. She worked her patch of earth, her mind often drifting down to the silent casks in the cellar. She resisted the urge to check them every day. Patience, she told herself, was an ingredient just like the pears. It was during this time that she first met Tom. He was the cooper's apprentice, a boy of about 15 with big hands and a perpetually worried expression. He was sent out to her place to deliver a mended water bucket, an errand no one else wanted. He found Elspeth wrestling with a rotten fence post, her face smudged with dirt and sweat. He didn't gawk or offer clumsy pity. He just watched her for a moment, then said, "You need a better lever for that, ma'am." He found a long, sturdy branch, showed her how to place the fulcrum stone, and together they wrenched the old post from the ground. Elspeth, surprised by his quiet competence, offered him a drink of water. He was shy, but he didn't seem to carry the town's judgment in him. He looked around the hardscrabble farm not with disdain, but with a kind of professional interest. "Your barrels," he said, nodding toward the barn. "If they sit empty too long, the staves will shrink." Elspeth hesitated. Her secret was hers alone, but something in the boy's earnest gaze made her trust him. "They're not empty," she said, and on an impulse, she led him not to the barn, but to the root cellar. She lifted the heavy door. A wave of cool air washed over them, carrying a strange, intriguing scent, fruity and sharp, with an undercurrent of something alive and yeasty. Tom breathed it in, his eyes wide. "What is that?" "Perry," she said, "or what I hope will be Perry." In the dim light, they looked at the row of casks. A gentle hissing came from the bungholes, the sound of a slow, steady fermentation. It was the sound of creation. Tom reached out and touched one of the barrels, his cooper's hands reading the wood. "It's working," he whispered, awestruck. From that day on, Tom became a quiet fixture at the farm. He would show up after his work in town was done, finding things to mend, a gate to rehang, a tool to sharpen. He was drawn to the purposefulness of the place, to the patient, methodical work that Elspeth did. He never asked for payment, but she always sent him home with a few eggs or a jar of her pickled beets. He was her first ally, the first person to see the farm not for what it was, but for what it could become. He guarded her secret as if it were his own. One evening in late May, Elspeth decided it was time. With Tom watching, she carefully tapped one of the smaller casks. She used a spile and mallet, her movements precise. She held a tin cup under the tap. The first few drops were cloudy, but then it ran clear, a pale, almost colorless liquid that fizzed gently in the cup. She handed it to Tom. "You first." He took it, his hand trembling slightly. He sniffed it. The aroma was delicate, floral, nothing like the heavy, apple and cinnamon smell of cider. He took a sip. His worried expression vanished, replaced by pure astonishment. It's like drinking flowers," he stammered. "And stars," Elspeth smiled, a real, unguarded smile. She took a sip herself. It was dry, crisp, and clean, with a subtle warmth that spread through her chest. It tasted of pears, yes, but also of the cool earth of the cellar, of patience, of a $4 gamble that had, against all odds, paid off. It had worked. In the quiet of the cellar, with only the boy as her witness, Elspeth felt a profound sense of victory, a feeling as bright and effervescent as the liquid in her cup. The arrival of Silas Croft at her farm in early June was as unwelcome as a fox in a henhouse. He rode up on a fine bay mare, his clothes immaculate despite the dust of the road. He controlled the valley's apple market, owned the largest cider press, and acted as the unofficial arbiter of agricultural worth in Providence Creek. He dismounted and surveyed her property with an air of magnanimous disdain. "Miss Elspeth," he began, his voice smooth as cream, "I was in the area and thought I would check on your progress. It is no small thing. A woman alone managing a place like this." His concern was a thin veneer over his condescension. He was not there to help. He was there to confirm his own judgment. "I'm managing, Mr. Croft," she said, her tone level. She did not invite him to sit. He gestured vaguely at her fields. "The soil here is poor. You'd be better off letting it go to pasture. In fact, I might be persuaded to take it off your hands. Give you a fair price, enough to set you up in a small room in town. It's no life for you out here. The life suits me," she said. It was a dismissal, but he chose to ignore it. He peered toward her barn, his eyes narrowed. "I trust you found a use for those pears." The word was weighted with amusement. "They fed the pigs through a lean month," she lied, the words tasting like ash. She would not give him the satisfaction. He nodded, his smile confirming that he had been right all along. "As I thought, a charitable, if not profitable, venture." He tipped his hat and rode away, confident in the world as he understood it, a world where value was obvious and anything strange was worthless. He did not know that less than a week later, his world and Elspeth's would briefly and profitably intersect. A fancy carriage, the kind used by the wealthy from the river city, broke an axle on the road a quarter-mile from Elspeth's gate. Its passenger was a man named Antoine, the chef of a renowned hotel restaurant, a man whose palate was as refined as it was demanding. While his driver struggled with the wheel, Chef Antoine, mortified by the dust and the heat, walked to Elspeth's farm in search of a glass of cool water. He was a small, fussy man in a ridiculously hot woolen suit, and he looked at Elspeth's rough hands and simple dress with open dismay. She gave him water from her well, cool and clean. As he drank, he paused, his head cocked. "What is that aroma?" he asked, his French accent thick. "From your cellar?" It was the smell of the Perry, a faint, fragrant ghost leaking from the stone walls. "Nothing," Elspeth said quickly, but the chef's curiosity was piqued. He was a man who followed scents the way a hound follows a trail. He walked to the cellar door, sniffing the air. "It is not cider. It is more delicate. Floral. May I?" Elspeth hesitated for a long moment. This man was an outsider, a world away from Providence Creek. He had no stake in her failure. She made a decision. She led him down into the cool dark and drew him a small glass of the Perry. He held it to the light from the open door, observing the pale color, the tiny, rising bubbles. He swirled it. He inhaled its scent deeply. Then he tasted it. His eyes closed. A slow, beatific smile spread across his face. "Mon Dieu, et whispered. This is not a farmer's drink. This is poetry." He opened his eyes and looked at her as if seeing her for the first time. "Where did you get this?" "I made it," she said. "From Pears. You must sell this to me," he declared. "I will pay you. I will pay you well." He named a price per bottle that made Elspeth's breath catch in her throat. It was more than she had dreamed. Before his carriage was mended, he had bought 2 small casks, paying in crisp bank notes that felt unreal in her calloused hand. He made her promise to save the rest for him. As he left, he turned back to her. "Those fools in your town," he said, gesturing vaguely toward Providence Creek. "What do they know of value? Nothing. This," he held up a bottle he had insisted on taking with him, "is the future the chef's purchase did not remain a secret." His driver talked in town while waiting for the blacksmith. The story spread like wildfire. The fancy city chef had bought something from the Pear Girl, something he paid a fortune for. The town's mockery began to curdle into a confused, resentful curiosity. What could she possibly have made from rotten fruit that a man like that would want? They didn't have an answer, and the not knowing vexed them more than her foolishness ever had. The sky that summer was a hard, brilliant blue, day after day. It was beautiful, and it was terrifying. The rains of June never arrived. By July, the dust on the road was ankle-deep, and Providence Creek, the stream that gave the town its name, had dwindled to a sluggish trickle between baked mudbanks. The corn in the fields grew stunted, its leaves curling in on themselves. The town's wells, which had always been reliable, began to drop. People started talking in hushed, worried tones. Mrs. Zelenko would stand on her porch, looking at the mercilessly clear sky. "The sky is too clean," she told Elspeth one evening, her voice grim. Like a plate washed for a famine, Elspeth felt the fear too. It was a low, constant hum beneath the surface of her days. She began her own arithmetic of the drought. Each morning, she would lower the bucket into her well, noting the place where the rope turned dark with water. Each day, the dark mark was a little higher. She measured out water for her garden, giving just enough to keep the tomato and bean plants alive. She gave the pigs the dishwater, letting nothing go to waste. The great apple orchards that carpeted the valley, the source of the town's pride and Silas Croft's wealth, began to show the strain. The leaves on the trees grew dull, and the young apples, which should have been swelling into fat, glossy orbs, remained small and hard. It was going to be a disastrous year for cider. The apples would be dry, their juice scant and sour. Croft, at first, had been dismissive of the drought. His own property had deep wells, bored by a steam engine years ago. But by mid-July, even he was looking worried. He rode through his orchards, his face tight. He spoke of the poor vintage to come, but his tone was one of inconvenience, not desperation. He would simply charge more for his inferior product. The town had no other choice. It was during this time that Elspeth noticed something remarkable. The small grove of pear trees her uncle had planted, the ones everyone ignored because their fruit was gnarled, hard, and useless for eating, were weathering the drought far better than the apple trees. Their leaves were still a deep, healthy green. While the apple trees had shallow, spreading roots that starve in the dry topsoil, the pear trees had a secret. They had a deep taproot, a lifeline plunging far down into the earth, drawing moisture from a place the drought had not yet reached. The despised, ugly trees were proving to be the most resilient. They were survivors. The town, obsessed with its apples, noticed nothing. But Silas Croft noticed. He had a keen eye for anything that might threaten his dominance. One afternoon, he rode out to her farm again. The false warmth of his previous visit was gone, replaced by a cold, appraising stare. He wasn't there to offer pity. He was there to do business. He dismounted and walked straight to her small pear grove, running a hand over the bark of one of the trees. "These trees seem to be holding up," he said, his voice casual, but his eyes sharp. "They are," Elspeth said, standing her ground. "I've been thinking," he continued, turning to face her. "With the apple crop being what it is, there might be a small market for alternative fruit. I would be willing to buy your entire pear crop. As it stands on the tree," he named a price. It was insultingly low, a price that assumed her ignorance and her desperation. He was trying to buy her resilience for pennies, to corner the only healthy fruit in the valley before anyone else realized its worth. Elspeth looked at him. She remembered his pitying smile at the market, his condescending offer to buy her land. She thought of the sweet, clear liquid in her cellar and the crisp bank notes from the city chef. A new kind of strength, cool and clear as her Perry, filled her. "They're not for sale, Mr. Croft," she said. Her voice was quiet, but it was as solid as the deep roots of her trees. He stared at her, genuinely shocked. He was not a man who was accustomed to being told no, especially by a woman with nothing. "That is a mistake," he said, his voice hardening. "A thing is only worth what others will pay. And right now, I'm the only one offering. I'll take my chances," she replied. He mounted his horse, his face a mask of cold fury. "You will regret this," he said, and rode away, leaving her alone in the shimmering heat, the dust settling around her like a promise of the hard times to come. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The creek bed was a cracked, gray scar on the land. The town's wells ran dry one by one, and a grim routine began. Each morning, people lined up with buckets at the few deep wells that still gave water, Crofts among them. His men dispensed the water grudgingly, a constant reminder of his power. The apple harvest was a funereal affair. The fruit was small, bitter, and mealy. When pressed, it yielded a thin, acidic juice. The great cider making, the annual festival of abundance, was reduced to a bitter chore. There would be cider, but it would be a thin, sour memory of other years, a drink of hardship. Amidst the valley's despair, Elspeth's farm was a quiet island of persistence. Her deep well still gave water, enough for her house and her garden, though she used it with the care of a miser counting gold. And her pear trees, drawing on their hidden reserves, were laden with fruit. The pears were not pretty. They were small and russet, their skins tough, but they were heavy with juice. While the town mourned its apples, Elspeth and Tom began their own harvest. They worked in the cool of the early mornings, picking the pears and laying them carefully in crates. They did not have enough to supply the whole valley, not by a long shot, but they had enough. They brought the fruit to the barn and left it to ripen further, the pears sweetening and softening in the heat. Then they began the pressing. The barn filled again with the sweet, honeyed scent of her improbable success. The juice that flowed from the press was thick and fragrant, a golden green elixir. They filled every cask she owned, the new juice mingling with the perry from the spring. Her cellar, once a place of speculative hope, was now a treasury, a liquid fortress against the coming winter. The annual Providence Creek Town Fair was a somber affair that year. The harvest tables were sparse, the prize vegetables undersized. The mood was brittle with anxiety. The main event, as always, was the judging of the cider. It was the measure of their year, the barometer of their fortunes. This year, the category was painfully small. Silas Croft's entry was the largest, presented in a handsome cask. When the judges tasted it, their faces gave nothing away, but everyone knew. It was the best of a bad lot. That was when Elspeth and Tom arrived. They didn't use a wagon, but carried a single, small cask between them, setting it down near the judge's table. A murmur went through the crowd. What was this? Silas Croft, seeing her, strode over. What is the meaning of this, Miss Elspeth? The cider entries are closed. It's not cider, Elspeth said calmly. She looked at Judge Miller. It's a pear wine. A perry. I'd like to enter it in the cordials and spirits category. The category was usually reserved for a few old women who made dandelion wine or blackberry cordial. It was an afterthought. To enter it now, in the face of the cider failure, was a bold and audacious act. The crowd surged closer, their curiosity overcoming their gloom. Croft's face flushed with anger. This is absurd. It's a non-traditional entry. It's unrated. I demand it be disqualified. Judge Miller, a man who disliked Croft's arrogance as much as he respected tradition, looked from Croft's furious face to Elspeth's calm one. He looked at the small, unassuming cask. The rules, he said slowly, allow for any fruit-based fermented beverage. The entry is valid. He gestured for a glass. Tom, his hands shaking slightly, tapped the cask and drew a measure. He handed the glass to the judge. It was the same glass, the same pale gold liquid that would silence the entire town. Elspeth stood her ground, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had brought her secret out of the cellar and into the harsh light of day. Now, all that was left was the verdict. The stage was set. The single glass of perry on the judge's table seemed to hold all the light and hope that had been bleached out of the summer. Judge Miller held it up, letting the sun shine through it. The crowd was a study in suspended animation. Silas Croft's smirk had returned, a brittle thing pinned to his face. He was certain this was a final, desperate act of foolishness. The judge took his sip, then another. The silence stretched, becoming unbearable. He set the glass down. He looked at the other two judges, who looked back at him, their faces full of questions. He gave a single, sharp nod. Then he turned to the crowd, his voice booming across the stunned quiet. In the category of cordials and spirits, he announced, the blue ribbon and the grand prize for best beverage of the fair goes to Miss Elspeth for her pear wine. For a moment, there was nothing. No cheers, just a collective intake of breath. The town was trying to rearrange its entire understanding of the world. The worthless pears, the foolish woman, the secret work. It didn't make sense. And then, the spell was broken by Silas Croft. His face was purple with rage. He strode toward the table, his composure shattered. This is a farce, he shouted, his voice cracking. A fluke. She cheated. She must have sugared it, watered it down. There's no way. How could she have made so much from those rotten pears? I counted the barrels myself when I rode past last. He stopped dead. The silence that followed was different. It was cold and sharp. He had, in his fury, admitted everything. His spying, his envy, his assumption of her failure. He had counted her barrels, assessing her worth and finding it wanting, only to be proven spectacularly wrong. The town turned to look at him, and for the first time, they saw him not as a pillar of their community, but as a greedy, petty man. His power, which had been built on their respect for his success, crumbled in that instant. But Elspeth had little time to savor his downfall. The crowd, its reality now fundamentally altered, surged toward her. The shock had worn off, replaced by a desperate, clamoring need. Miss Elspeth, a farmer called out, a man who had laughed at her in the spring. My apples were ruined. I have nothing for the winter. Will you sell some of your perry? How much? Another voice cried. Name your price. They crowded around her, their faces etched with the fear of a long, dry winter. They were ready to be gouged. They expected it. In her hands, she held the only real success of the harvest season. She had a monopoly on hope. She could have named any price. She could have become as rich and as ruthless as Silas Croft had been. She could have punished them for every laugh, every pitying glance, every whispered judgment. The arithmetic of revenge was simple. The arithmetic of community she was discovering was much harder. She looked at their faces, and she didn't see customers to be exploited. She saw her neighbors. She saw the lines of worry around their eyes, the dust of the failed harvest on their clothes. She saw the proud, frightened farmer whose children would be thirsty. She held up a hand for silence. The crowd quieted, waiting for her verdict, for the price of their salvation. Elspeth took a deep breath, the air tasting of dust and her own improbable victory. She looked out over the sea of anxious faces, faces she had seen every day in town, faces that had worn masks of scorn or pity. Now they were stripped bare, showing only need. She saw Mr. Henderson, the blacksmith, whose wife was ailing. She saw the widow Gable, who had 3 young children. She saw the very farmer who had sold her the pears, his expression a mixture of awe and profound regret. She had the power to make them pay for their mockery, to hoard her success and watch them suffer. But the memory of Mrs. Zelenko's words came to her. A thing is not worthless because a blind man cannot see its value. And what was the value of this victory if it was not shared? What good was a full cellar if your neighbors were empty? "The Perry is for sale," she announced, her voice carrying clearly in the hush. "But not today. Come to the farm tomorrow at dawn. Form a line. Each family may purchase 1 5-gallon cask." A murmur of anticipation went through the crowd. They were waiting for the other shoe to drop for the ruinous price. "The price," she said, her voice steady and clear, "is $1 per gallon." A gasp went through the crowd. It was a fair price, a shockingly fair price. It was a price that allowed her to recoup her costs, to buy what she needed for the winter, and to invest in the next season. But it was not a price of exploitation. It was a price that acknowledged their shared hardship. It was the price of a neighbor, not a monopolist. It was, in its own quiet way, an act of radical generosity. The tension in the crowd broke. It was replaced by a wave of palpable relief, of gratitude so profound it was humbling. Silas Croft stood alone, forgotten, his face a thunderous mask of disbelief. He could not comprehend it. He would have bled them dry. He did not understand that Elspeth was not trying to win the game he played. She was inventing a new one entirely. The next morning, as the sun rose, they came. A long, orderly line of wagons and carts snaked down the dirt road from her farm. But they did not come just as customers. They came as a community reborn. The men helped Tom roll the heavy casks from the cellar. The women brought Elspeth gifts, a loaf of bread, a jar of precious canned tomatoes, a newly knitted shawl. They were small offerings, tokens of a new respect. One of the last in line was a farmer named Jed, a man whose laughter had been among the loudest back in March. He approached her, his hat in his hands, his eyes on the ground. "Miss Elspeth," he mumbled, I can't afford the $5. My well is dry. My corn is dust. I have nothing." Elspeth looked at him, at his worn-out boots and the desperation in his posture. She remembered his scorn, but she also saw his present fear. "Can you work?" she asked. He looked up, surprised. I need to clear another acre of land this spring to plant more pear trees," she said. "Give me your word you'll give me 1 week of your labor. When the ground thaws, you have it," he swore, his voice thick with emotion. "Then the cask is yours," she said, and she instructed Tom to load one onto his wagon. Jed looked at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears. He didn't know what else to say. He just nodded, a promise and an apology all in one. As the last wagon pulled away, the sun was high in the sky. Her cellar was much emptier, but her farm felt fuller than it ever had before. It was filled with the echoes of goodwill, with the threads of new connections that bound her, at last, to the town that had once cast her out. Winter came, and it was as hard as the sky had promised. The thin, sour cider ran out by Christmas. But in nearly every home in Providence Creek, there was a cask of Elspeth's Perry. It was sipped on cold nights, shared with neighbors, and doled out at celebrations. It became more than a drink. It became the story of their survival, a liquid reminder of how close they had come to ruin and how they had been saved not by a wealthy man's power, but by a quiet woman's foresight and a generous heart. Elspeth's name was spoken with a new reverence. She was no longer the pear girl or that woman alone. She was Elspeth, the one who had seen value in the worthless, the one who had chosen fairness when she could have had a fortune. Silas Croft's influence in the valley was broken. His cider was a joke, and his greed, exposed at the fair, was a stain he could not wash away. People found other mills to grind their grain, other merchants to buy their goods. By the time the spring thaw came, he had sold his grand house and his cidery to a family from the city and moved away, a man undone by a barrel of bruised fruit. The spring was a time of renewal in more ways than one. The rains returned, gentle and steady, soaking into the grateful earth. Providence Creek swelled its banks, and the valley turned a vibrant, hopeful green. At Elspeth's farm, the change was even more profound. She was not alone. Tom was now her full-time partner, his apprenticeship at the cooper's shop finished. He was learning the art of the parry, his future tied to the farm. And on the first warm day of April, Jed and 3 other farmers arrived, as promised, with their axes and shovels. They worked for a week, clearing the stubborn scrub oak and turning the hard clay soil, preparing the ground for a new orchard. Elspeth paid them in the last of the previous year's parry and a fair wage besides. She was not just a farmer now. She was an employer, a leader. She directed the work with a quiet, confident authority that no one questioned. They were planting a future for the whole valley, a future rooted in the lessons of the drought. One afternoon, as they were setting the last of the young pear saplings, cuttings taken from her own resilient trees, into the newly cleared earth, Mrs. Zelenko shuffled over from her porch. She carried 2 small glasses. Elspeth paused in her work, wiping the sweat from her brow, and went to meet her. The old woman handed her a glass. It was filled with the perry from the very first batch, which Elspeth had saved. It had aged in the bottle, its flavors deepening, growing richer and more complex. They stood together, looking out at the scene, the new orchard, the men working together, the greening land. Mrs. Zelenko took a sip of the perry, her eyes closing in satisfaction. She smiled, a deep, knowing smile that crinkled her entire face. She looked at Elspeth, who stood not as a scorned outsider, but as the respected heart of a healing community. "You see, my dear," she said, her voice soft but clear as a bell. "I told you. The sweetest juice comes from the ugliest fruit." Elspeth looked at the small, gnarled saplings, then at the faces of her neighbors, their features weathered by hardship, but now lit with common purpose. She thought of the bruised, rejected pears and the golden liquid they had become. She thought of her own lonely struggle and the rich, full life it had yielded. Mrs. Zelenko was right. The truth of it was all around her, as real and as nourishing as the good earth beneath her feet.